is really somewhat like Luke Skywalker. Is that really true?
Well, I think it's obvious. Lucas, the alter ego aspect is very clear, but I think really Star Wars is like all of Lucas's films, semi-autobiographical. It stemmed from his childhood fantasies, from watching TVs, watching movies on TV, reading comic books, and eventually all the stuff found its culmination in Star Wars.
Now, George, as a young guy, kind of kept to himself on the porch, would read a lot of comic books, didn't have a lot of friends.
He was a very shy and reclusive kid. In fact, when I went back to Modesto, California, the small central California town where he grew up, and I asked his friends what they remembered about him, they couldn't remember him. In fact,
Nice.
one of them said, well, he was basically a non-entity. And I think it's hard to believe that the George Lucas whose imagination we know now was that same George Lucas.
Some incredible drive, obviously, that sort of spurred him on. I want to get to that in a moment. But first, because you've had an opportunity to sort of really study Lucas and study the films, even be on some of the sets, when other people haven't. I'd like to find out some of the inside scoop about Star Wars, if I could, from you. As I understand it, when Star Wars first was being made, or prior to it being made, it really had a much different kind of a feel about it. What was Star Wars originally supposed to be like?
Well, Star Wars originally was almost like a giant anthropological treatise. Lucas was obsessed with this idea of building his own universe. So he started out, he had one movie all about Wookiees, which were, of course, the large, furry aliens that we came to know through Chewbacca. And indeed, if you look in Return of the Jedi, the Ewoks are this Wookiee civilization that Lucas wanted to create in his first film. He just chopped them in half, made them small and furry, and actually the name Ewok is an anagram of Wookiee.
I'll be darned.
So people, I think, are unaware of that.
What about Luke Skywalker? Was he in there all along?
He started out as a very old man, as a 65-year-old general, and finally Lucas realized, well, gee, if I'm intending this film for young people, which is exactly the audience he was aiming at, I better make my hero young. So Luke Skywalker went from an old man to a teenager. Princess Leia went from a 12-year-old princess to a young woman. And Lucas therefore decided to take the Han Solo character, which started out as Luke's older brother, and spin him off into more of the roguish pirate and give him Leia as a love interest. And ironically, Han Solo was originally green, with gills and no nose, and I don't think Harrison Ford would have taken the part then.
No, absolutely not. Some of the people who wanted to be in Star Wars and didn't make the cut.
This is a great list of also has-beens, and of course many of them went on to fame and fortune in other roles. Among the characters rejected for Luke Skywalker was Christopher Walken.
Oh my gosh.
And Will Seltzer, who was a young actor who was later in More American Graffiti. Lucas liked him so much when he couldn't use him in Star Wars, he put him in another one of his films.
How about Nolte? Was Nolte ever...
Nolte was up for Han Solo.
Yeah, oh my gosh.
And Princess Leia, the rejects included Jodie Foster and Amy Irving. So I think you see that things might have been very differently had the film been cast.
When did he make some of these changes on Star Wars?
Well, Star Wars was such a tortuous process for Lucas. He spent 3 years writing the screenplay. In fact, it was so difficult for him to write that when he would get particularly frustrated, he would snip off some of his hair. And his secretary came in one morning when he was really blocked.
You mean that was just sort of a neurotic
It was a neurotic,
habit that he had?
When he would get really frustrated, he'd pick up a pair of scissors and snip off a lock of hair. Well, she came in one morning and there was hair all over the room and poor Lucas was almost bald. So writing a screenplay is not as easy as
he
people
changed
make it
Luke's
seem.
name, didn't he, just before they started the shooting?
It was Luke Starkiller, and the day before they started filming, he thought that sounded a little too violent, so he changed it to Luke Skywalker, which of course was useful for me. It gave me the title of my book.
Yeah, exactly. Now, were these really fantasy figures that he had seen as a kid? Was he the Robin Williams type where he'd sit up in his room and just sort of play movie director as a young boy?
Just the opposite. If anything, Lucas would sit up in his room, drink Cokes, eat French fries, and listen to records. But I think the Star Wars characters were definitely influenced by the movie serials and the Buck Rogers, Flash Gordon stuff he had seen as a kid. But Lucas had a much more serious purpose in mind when he sat down to write these 3 films. He wanted to build a contemporary fairy tale, and he did a lot of academic research for 2 years, exploring the mythology and the folklore and the fairy tales of a lot of different cultures, trying to find the common elements that would appeal to children. So if you look at Star Wars, it's really a fairy tale. And that's why I think it's been so popular all around the world.
He's a very moral guy, good versus evil and all that. We got to break away for a commercial. When we come back, let's talk about that. Also, I'd love to know about some of the costume problems they had with Chewbacca and R2-D2 and with the heat of the set and everything that happened to them. As we continue this morning with Dale Pollock, we're talking about the Star Wars movies. Star Wars, even during the commercial break this morning. Let's talk about some of the characters that we've seen in Star Wars and tell me how they work. First of all, Yoda, who was in the second movie and then died in the third movie.
Yoda was a very difficult creation for Stuart Freeborn, who was the makeup guy, to do, because his lips had to move, his eyes had to move, and those green ears had to move. And they had a lot of trouble coordinating that. And Alec Guinness actually was happy, who played Ben Kenobi, was happy to see the character introduced, because all those boring speeches about the Force, he kept saying to Irv Kirchner, the director of Empire, why don't you let the little green thing give this speech? He was very happy to see Yoda.
Now, the little green thing, Yoda, was basically all electronically controlled?
It was a Muppet, in effect, operated by Frank Oz, who does Miss Piggy. So if the voice sounds remotely like Miss Piggy or Grover from Sesame Street, that's why.
And then so it was completely with some electronic...
No, it was basically all the hand puppet, yeah.
I'll be darned. What about Jabba the Hutt? Now, Jabba is, he made the cover of People magazine a few months back, a few weeks back. Quite a character, and you saw how that was worked on the set.
Yes, Jabba was a little bigger than Yoda. In fact, he was about half of a wall high and about 30 feet wide, and it took 5 men to operate him. And there would be one behind each eye, and these eyes were like huge medicine balls, very moist and rolling, and one in each arm, which was sort of like flippers, and then a poor little dwarf had to lie in the tail, lie horizontally, and move his legs and head to simulate the moving of the tail.
And that would flip it around.
And that would flip it around. And then they had another person who was doing Jabba's voice, and of course what is called Huttese, which is really a sort of Inca dialect, Quechuan, run backwards at a high speed.
Sure, like we'd know. Like you really didn't have to go to all that bother. Was Jabba supposed to be in the first movie?
He was, and indeed scenes were filmed with Jabba the Hutt, and Lucas was so disgusted with how the special effect looked at that stage, this was in 1976, that he cut Jabba out. And Jabba had to wait 2 more movies to make a reappearance.
He was referred to in the first movie, though.
Yes, and there was a scene in which Jabba ordered Greedo, the bounty hunter, to go after Han Solo, but that scene was excised.
All right, we're going to do a little trivia test right now, a little Star Wars trivia test. What do R2-D2 and the head Ewok have in common? That's the little munchkin that is running around in the...
They were both played by the same actor, Kenny Baker. But indeed, Kenny Baker was not required that much to be inside R2-D2 by the time of Return of the Jedi. They had finally, after 3 films, perfected how this robot was going to work. On the first film, Star Wars, when they were in the desert, R2-D2 was radio operated, and he kept picking up Libyan radio stations.
Because they were in Tunisia?
They were in Tunisia. So he kept getting these radio signals, and instead of walking right, he would just play Libyan music. And the second one, The Empire Strikes Back, they thought they had perfected him, and every time they give him a radio command, he'd walk into a wall. So they just had a lot of trouble with R2-D2, and it was very painful, actually, for the poor guys who had to make R2-D2. They constructed this gleaming blue and white robot, just looked beautiful, and Lucas came on the set and took one look and said, make him dirty. So they had to take him out in the yard, kick him, hit him with a few mallets and sledgehammers.
Rub dirt all over him?
Rub dirt all over him. These poor guys who worked months to create this beautiful robot just sat there with tears coming down their eyes.
Part of Lucas's control over the thing. How about C-3PO? Of course, Anthony Daniels has been with us before talking about it, but I understand that he had a lot of problems with getting the costume fitted.
Well, the costume was very painful for him. In fact, he suffered deep lacerations in his elbows and knees because of the costume in the first 2 films. And he has a difficulty in that no one can really hear him. His voice has to be redubbed later. He can't see through those yellow eyes, so he keeps bumping into things. And nobody relates to him as a person. He's treated as a robot, and that's not happy for any actor.
Yeah, he was really bummed out about that, wasn't he?
Well, he felt that the stills from the film would say Mark Hamill and C-3PO, that he was never given enough credit. In fact, he's one of the few people that I talked to while preparing Skywalker who was really somewhat negative about George Lucas.
Huh. Was he still paid as much as the rest of the people?
No, that was another bone of contention. His share was...
It does have a tendency sometimes to cloud the issue a little bit.
Well, and in his mind, Lucas would have preferred that he was a real robot, not an actor inside the suit. It's easier to deal with the machine for George Lucas.
Lucas kind of came on the scene about the same time Steven Spielberg did with Jaws. They seemed to be young, real hotshots. I mean, these guys have done a lot for Hollywood, brought a lot of money in. Are they friends? Do they work together? There's been reports that one of them even helped the other edit some of the films. Any of this true, Dale?
Well, of course, they did Raiders of the Lost Ark together. They are very close personal friends. In fact, I would say Spielberg is one of Lucas' closest friends right now. And when people heard that they were going to be working together on Raiders, they feared this giant collision of egos. That would be the real Star Wars, people thought.
Yeah.
And indeed, that collision never happened. They worked together extremely well. Lucas respects Spielberg as a director. Spielberg loves Lucas as a producer because Lucas was a director. He knows how movies are made. And they're working together right now on a sequel to Raiders.
Other than Raiders, was Spielberg ever involved in any way on any of the Star Wars movies?
No.
Never did any of the editing or anything?
No, had no involvement. But actually, Lucas gave Spielberg a key suggestion for E.T. In Spielberg's original concept for E.T., there were 30 E.T.s. And Lucas said, why don't you cut it down to one? Audiences can relate to one character much better than they can to 30.
I'll be darned.
And Spielberg followed that suggestion, and the rest is movie history.
Yeah, it sure is. They've both done pretty well together. Dale, we got to break away again for a commercial. When we come back, we'll continue talking more about George Lucas and where's he going to go from here. He's got a big trilogy to try to fulfill. We'll be right back. Indiana Jones, but I understand that Harrison Ford, Dale, was the second choice for Indiana Jones?
Absolutely. The first choice was Tom Selleck, star of Magnum P.I. And the minute CBS heard that Lucas was interested in Selleck, they decided to put Magnum P.I. on the screen because they realized anybody that George Lucas is interested in must have something going for him. In fact, Lucas could probably make a lot of TV stars that way.
It probably could. He liked to get unknown people, right?
He likes unknown people for two reasons. First of all, the audience doesn't come to them with preconceptions, and secondly, he doesn't have to pay them as much.
Gee, I wonder what old Harrison Ford thought about Tom Selleck being the first choice. Was he bummed out at all?
No, I think he was happy. He was having difficulty escaping Han Solo, and this gave him the opportunity to do that.
Now, you go through in your book about Marcia Lucas and George Lucas and what a team they are. Marcia does a lot of the editing. She's a fine editor. And then we hear early this week now that they've announced they're going to get a divorce. What happened?
Well, obviously, I don't know their most innermost feelings. They are very private people. They keep those feelings to themselves. But I think she wanted to continue her career as an editor. She won an Academy Award for Star Wars. Lucas didn't. And she's very respected in the industry as an editor. She edited Taxi Driver for Marty Scorsese, and she was offered King of Comedy to edit. And I think that she's a little tired of being in the shadow of her husband.
I'll be darned. Did you have any inkling that that was happening when you were...
In retrospect, of course, these things make a little more sense, but I think the portrait I draw of Marcia in Skywalker is of a very independent-minded, talented woman who had designs on her own career, and that's exactly what she's doing.
What do you think this is going to do, or what effect do you think it'll have on George Lucas?
Well, I think it'll have an impact on his films. She brought a much more human dimension to his movies. He's more interested in action, getting on to the next scene, to the next special effect.
What do you mean the human aspect?
She's more interested in the characters, what happens. In Raiders of the Lost Ark, for instance, Marcia suggested the very ending. They had left Marion Ravenwood, the Karen Allen character, out in the ocean clinging to a submarine. She said, you can't leave her there, we got to bring her back. It's that kind of thing, thinking about the characters rather than just the special effects.
Of course, she finishes up the movie with
Harrison Ford walking down the steps.
He's talked about a trilogy, 3 trilogies, 9 movies all total for Star Wars. He's got 3. He's got 6 left to go. What do you think's going to happen? Will he make them?
Not in the near future. I think basically Lucas is sick to death of Star Wars at this point. It's been 10 years of his life that he has been consumed by these movies, and I think he would like nothing better than to not think about Princess Leia, Darth Vader, Luke Skywalker, or Han Solo for the immediate future.
Yet you mentioned that the fact that this was an unassuming guy who really liked to make films, and all of a sudden he's found himself very rich. He's had to become a businessman. 6 Star Wars properties, my goodness, it would be worth so much money. He really can't just turn his face to them.
I don't think so, and he's aware of how much audiences want to see this story continue, the saga go on. So I think that it's in time we may see the first trilogy, which would have Ben Kenobi and Darth Vader as young men, which show the establishment of the Empire and the turning of Darth Vader to the dark side of the Force, and the final trilogy, which would have Luke Skywalker as an old man and the repopulation of the universe with Jedi Knights.
You mentioned a point. Do you think he would sell those properties off to somebody else and let somebody else make the Star Wars movies?
He jokes about it in the sense that it would make him look better for the work that he did, but I think he has too much of an emotional investment. The thing that's really going to determine whether these films get made is the cost factor. The first Star Wars movie cost $11.5 million. Jedi cost $40 million. By the time the next trilogy is finished, the films might cost $80 million. And I don't care how big of a blockbuster hit you have, that's a hard nut to crack.
They bring in a lot of money. What's George Lucas worth?
We figure he's worth $70 million between his personal fortune and his corporate wealth. And that doesn't include the value of the Star Wars films or the nearly $2 billion in merchandising that Star Wars has created.
I'd like to be the divorce attorneys on that separation out in California. Real Lulu. Dale, thank you very, very much. Dale Pollock. And the name of the book is called Skywalking, the Life and Films of George Lucas. We enjoyed it. Thank you, Dale.
Thank you, Rob. Nice to be here.
We're going to be back with more in just a moment on AM. Stay with us.